What if I told you your vote has a dollar sign on it and it carries an investment into your own neighborhood? Your vote helps determine what's built and what passes into our state budget. And right now, North Carolina's budget is not working for the people, but is being funded by you, the people. We're talking about a $29.7 billion budget that decides whether your child's school teachers gets a raise, whether your neighbor keeps their Medicaid, whether families across this state get the investment that they were promised. Months have passed, and the legislative long session that was supposed to deliver a new budget hasn't. State agencies are frozen, educators are testifying, and while the politicians debate over the budget, the people are paying the price. So today we're going to break it down: what the budget is, why it's stalled, and what democracy has to do with all of it. This is Built by Us.
Welcome.
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 You're listening to Built by Us.
Built by Us.
Built by Us.
Built by Us.
Welcome back to Built by Us podcast, a podcast of, by, and for the people. And I'm Kai McNeil. And today's guests have spent years breaking down one of the most complex documents in our government into what it means for the people of North Carolina. Our first guest, Sally Hodges-Koppel, is a senior policy analyst at North Carolina Budget and Tax Center, where she focuses on state revenue trends, economic inequality, and the connection between fiscal policy and the community well-being. Also joining us from the North Carolina Budget and Tax Center is Mariah Collins, campaign coordinator who develops policy campaigns, works with partners to implement them, and helps connect communities to the policy process. Thank you both for joining us, Sally and Mariah. It's such a pleasure to have you on today's show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's start with the basics. What is the state budget and how do the people fund the state budget, and how does it affect their day-to-day lives?
Yeah, so our state budget is basically a spending plan for our public dollars in North Carolina. We all contribute to the state budget when we pay taxes, and we benefit from the services that our state budget provides. So it determines the level of resources and staffing at our kids' schools. It determines the availability of childcare and the affordability of childcare. It determines whether universities can provide a high level of quality programming or whether they have to make cuts and increase tuition. And when we have a well-funded state budget, it also supports local governments and their planning and alleviates pressure on those governments to raise property taxes or other local revenue. So it touches every part of our lives, and we should all have a say in how it's developed.
Mariah, could you walk us through how do our state taxes contribute to this budget? Like, where is the money really coming from that is making up this $29.7 billion document?
So, our state taxes go into the general fund, which is the main bucket of money that our state has to pay for goods and services. Every time someone earns a wage, buys a pair of shoes, renews their driver's license, or fills their gas tank, that's tax revenue coming into our state budget. And every time a child goes to public school, a family calls 911, or a student enrolls at a community college, that's our state tax dollars at work. So, how much money is collected? So, the North Carolina General Fund in 2022 and 2023, they collected over half of their revenue from the personal income taxes that we pay to the state. So, that is $16.8 billion. And they also collected about a third from the sales tax that we pay when we pay for things at the store. That's $10.8 billion that we are paying in sales tax that is going to support our needs. And also the state collected $1.6 billion, which is 5%, but still a significant portion from the income taxes that corporations pay on the money that they make in profits in our state. So those funds in the general fund are the people's dollars that our state uses to spend on things that we need in our communities.
Sally, if our general fund is the most important part of the state budget, because it is like the people's dollars, who and what determines how much we pay in taxes and how much each person kind of contributes to this general fund?
Yeah, so our state tax code is largely determined by our General Assembly, our state lawmakers. They have a ton of power over setting corporate and personal income tax rates and deciding how much revenue we bring into our state budget and who pays. Right now in North Carolina, we have what we call an upside down state and local tax code, where families with the lowest incomes, who are paid the least by their employers, pay the highest share of their income in state and local taxes each year, while the richest 1% pay the lowest share. So that's why we call it upside down, because those with the least are being asked to contribute the most. And that upside down picture has been getting worse over time because state lawmakers have, since 2013, been choosing to cut corporate income taxes, those taxes Mariah was talking about, cut personal income tax rates. And when we make those cuts, it disproportionately benefits the wealthiest while leaving our state with not enough revenue, not enough public dollars to fund the services and the high quality state services that people expect. And we actually just got an update this week on what's called a revenue forecast, how much we're going to expect to collect this year and next year. And that forecast told us that our revenue is going to decrease. So even as we have a growing population, we have growing needs, we know that we want to pay our teachers more and better, more professionally, we're going to have less revenue to be able to do that. And our communities are already struggling. So that's why lawmakers have so much power to change course and to choose differently than they have been choosing over the last decade plus.
That is really eye-opening to think about, that the same people who make the budget also determine how much money we contribute to the budget. When we're speaking about lawmakers in that process, how do they go about making the budget in North Carolina? Like, what does that process look like for someone who may not be familiar with it?
Yeah, so at the Budget and Tax Center, we kind of talk about the official state budget process in 8 steps that I can go through super quickly. It basically starts with state agencies submitting budget requests to the governor. They say, this is how much we think we will need to provide this level of services to our people, to our state. So that's step one. Then, what I just talked about, the consensus revenue forecast is released. That forecast is what tells the governor and lawmakers and the public how much money, how much tax dollars they will have to work with to fulfill those budget requests and the needs of the people of North Carolina, because we have to have a balanced budget in North Carolina. Next, the governor releases a recommended budget. So we expect to see that soon this year. And that's a suggestion from the governor to lawmakers, saying this is one way that I think we could do this. But then it's really up to the House and the Senate to create their own budget proposals. Each chamber votes to pass their own proposal, and then they put together what's called a conference committee with members from both the House and the Senate to develop a final proposal. And this is where the process broke down this year, that I know we'll talk about more later. But those lawmakers were unable to come to an agreement on a final budget proposal. But if they had passed it by that June 30th deadline, then it would go to the governor, who can either sign it into law, veto it, send it back to the legislature for changes or for a veto override, or the governor can let it become law without a signature, which is a way to say, I don't necessarily approve of everything that's in here, but I'm not going to stop it from becoming our final budget. So those are the official steps of the process.
In that process, Sally kind of pointed out where we are stuck. Why are we stuck in that step of the process? If you could just kind of walk us through, why don't we have a budget? I think that's the question so many people in North Carolina are asking. Um, I know we're one of the few states left who don't have a state budget approved.
Yes. Right now, we're the only state that does not have a comprehensive budget approved for this year. It was supposed to be passed last year on June 30th of 2025, as Sally mentioned. But right now we're stuck. And that's largely due to the disagreement between the NC House and the NC Senate leadership specifically on how to move ahead with more tax cuts for the rich. Um, the House wants to slow down while the Senate wants to keep the current tax cut schedule or even speed it up, which means that the House, they want to raise the revenue threshold that would trigger these tax cuts, specifically the personal income tax cut that individuals pay, because they see the writing on the wall with the consistent revenue forecast that was just passed. And but the Senate is more interested in speeding those up and even, um, passing those tax cuts that would affect how much money North Carolina has to spend on its priorities in the future. So this disagreement really underscores how the state budget process has been upended in recent years, where power is concentrated specifically with the leaders of the House and the Senate. And they are the only ones who really have the final say in making the final spending decisions. Um, and they often, have or they agree on an arbitrary spending cap that they determine at the outset, even before um, departments and agencies put forth their needs, which does not account for the ways that, costs increase or shift over time, specifically when it comes to what the state provides. Um, and also, speaking of like the democracy in the budget process, there's little room for review of community needs in that process. And also, there's not many opportunities for people to provide input in the state budget process in determining how our public money should be spent. Even lawmakers who are not in leadership don't have enough time to read the entire budget document before they have to make decisions on it. So yeah, the state budget process sorely needs some revisions in terms of how we can make it a more democratic process for the people to participate in because it is the state lawmakers are spending our public money on, and we need to make sure that they know that um, what needs we have.
You pointed out something really, a big connection there between democracy and the budget process and the budget itself is the people vote in these lawmakers to represent them, using their vote to say that these people represent me and will make decisions on my behalf. But I think another thing you just pointed out there, Mariah, is the lack of input from the people after that part into the budget process. What would a process that would include the people's voice look more like?
So we like at the North Carolina Veterans Tax Center, we like to talk about a well-being budget process that focuses more on the needs of the communities and the needs of the people and giving them a voice in that process. Um, so we talk about it like as having like three pillars. So those three pillars are really the backbone of what we envision as a process, a state budget process that focuses on people's well-being and not on the political machinations or the politicized process of getting a state budget. So, our framework includes having a transparent and inclusive process that allows people to have a voice into where our public money is spent. We also hope that this well-being budget matches spending to people's priorities and also follows the evidence for what we know what good policy and what good spending looks like and what that would provide for people.
Just as an example of what Mariah was sharing about a well-being budget, that includes a transparent process. There are specific things that people could demand that lawmakers require as part of the process, like a public hearing on the state budget or a week for public comment on the budget proposals, or require a certain number of meetings of lawmakers where the purpose is just debate on the budget proposals they're looking at, so that there's time for that robust debate before a vote is held. Because too often, as Mariah said, we see lawmakers vote on thousands of pages of budget documents that they only received 2 days before, haven't had time to read or understand the implications of. So those are some examples of specific, process steps that we could require that would make room for more community voice and even more, of our elected lawmakers' voices who are shut out of the process by leadership.
I know Democracy and C would love to see a budget that involves the people more, because I think when you start to look at, um, the people's dollars being spent, you almost want to make sure that the people are getting what they need, and it sounds like the well-being budget would kind of lean towards more of that. When we start to think about the people and now we don't have a state budget. When we don't have a state budget, Mariah, how does that affect the people in the long-term effects, especially now us being close to, I guess, almost approaching a little bit under a year? What were some of probably the short-term effects of the budget not being passed? And what are some of the long-term effects we could see with the budget not being passed?
Yes, so that's a great question. I think some of the impacts that we are seeing now is that there's a lot of unmet needs and a lot of trickle down effects that this is having for local economies, and for counties and cities across our state. Um, there's When we don't have a state budget, there's a lot of programs that are unfunded. Um, there also there's no teacher raises, no raises for state employees. Um, there's no movement on Leandro or public education investments. And there's also not a lot of wiggle room to respond to changing needs. I know in the past couple years, I don't know if we said this yet, but I think when we don't have a state budget, we fall it was passed in state law that we fall back on the last comprehensive state budget. So that means 2023. So right now, the state is operating off of the 2023 state budget. But that does not account for the increased costs and the inflation that people across the state, as well as services and programs that are having to keep up with these increased costs without seeing funding that they expect from the state. Um, so that includes anything from the cost of a fire truck to the cost of sending your child to daycare. Um, so that's what happens in the short term. In the long term, when we don't have a state budget, that's just more and more needs that are going into effect, or more and more needs that are being unmet at the state. Um, and also, there's no way to, again, account for the increased costs that are being seen at that level or at the state level. Um, and also, which is impacting people's daily lives as schools remain underfunded, as child care centers may be forced to close, as hospitals may be forced to close or reduce their services, which impacts the overall well-being of the people in that community.
Sally, Murray pointed out just now that we are operating off of an older budget, the 2023, 2024 previous state budget. North Carolina has a shifting landscape, and just like any place in the world has a growing population. Is it even possible for a 2023-2024 state budget to meet the needs of a 2026 North Carolina? Like, is that even, from a number standpoint, even possible?
No, that outdated budget is absolutely not meeting the needs of North Carolinians in 2026. As you mentioned, our population is growing and households, feel the effects of inflation in their own household budgets. Inflation also impacts our state budget. It costs more to provide the same level of services. Those costs are going up over time. The number of people that we need to serve in our state goes up over time and our needs change. We just had this massive federal legislation in 2025, the so called One Big Beautiful Bill, that shifts new costs onto state government and local government for the first time that used to be covered by the federal government. So now the state is required to comply with this federal legislation that they didn't know about back in 2023. So circumstances have changed, and as we were talking about with the well-being budget, a true well-being state budget would assess the real needs in communities. We see teachers leaving to teach in states where they're paid better. We see childcare centers closing in North Carolina despite a great need for accessible, affordable childcare. We see long waits at the DMV. Our Medicaid program is set to run out of funding in April. So the needs are urgent. They're different than they were in 2023. And so that's why lawmakers really need to make a choice here about, are we going to secure the revenue, the public dollars that North Carolinians need in 2026 and pass a state budget that meets that need instead of continuing these automatic tax cuts. And that's where we are talking about democracy, of bringing the people's voice to say, we don't want tax cuts for the rich. We do want our well-being needs funded in North Carolina.
The people's needs aren't being met, and that's really sad because it's the people's dollars. It's really their state dollars that are not being that are not that are not being allowed to be used on the services and the things that they need. When we start to think about their needs not being met, but also lawmakers needing to make this decision, Mariah, what would need to happen for a budget to be approved? And hypothetically, when could this happen? And more importantly, when could the people's needs be met?
So that is a very good question. So right now, we know that lawmakers are expected to come back this month and or next month in April to restart debates on the budget, um, and hopefully getting that for our state. So that means that they'll be re debating these tax cuts and sort of negotiating on whether to slow down or speed up these tax cuts again. Um, so, in order for that to happen, the state House leader and state Senate leader would have to agree on whether to slow down or speed up these tax cuts for the rich and for corporations. So that that could happen this session, um, starting April and going until June or late June when the this fiscal year ends. Um, so yeah, we would really need the state and House leadership to come to some sort of agreement on whether to slow down or speed up these tax cuts for for a budget to be approved and to so yeah.
Sally, you pointed out earlier two different things. Our state revenue is going down according to this March, um, and according to this March consensus. The tax cuts are getting bigger, it seems like, from what you guys have pointed out, and our budget is at a stalemate. What does that mean for the people of North Carolina? And almost how important is the budget being approved, and even some of these adjustment to taxes for the people of North Carolina?
Yeah, great question. North Carolina obviously needs a state budget, but it it doesn't need just any state budget, right? Lawmakers can pass a budget that enacts deep cuts and continues tax cuts for the rich. That is not what the people are saying they want. So it's important to get a budget, but it's important to get a budget that meets this moment, because North Carolina is at a crossroads. This revenue forecast made it so crystal clear. If we continue the way that we're going to trigger these automatic tax cuts. They've put them on autopilot. So we're going to trigger these automatic deep tax cuts that don't benefit most people, but definitely benefit the very wealthy. And it's going to lead to this enormous structural deficit in our budget within the next couple of years. We're talking multi-billion-dollar deficits. To close that gap, you either need to find the revenue in a fair, equitable way, or lawmakers will be forced to enact those deep cuts across state services to close that gap. So those are kind of the choices that are before lawmakers right now. So it's a really important session this year. It's a really important moment for lawmakers to be clear on the decision that's ahead of them. And as Mariah said, this conflict over future tax cuts was at the root of the budget impasse, and it's going to be at the root of where we go forward from here.
If a budget was approved, what would be some of the immediate impacts or effects that North Carolinians will be able to see?
All depends on what kind of budget is approved. North Carolina is a wealthy state that if we make those good tax choices, we have the resources to give sizable raises to our state teachers who have been neglected for too long. We have the resources to give raises to state employees, where our state government is having a hard time recruiting and retaining employees in crucial roles because pay has not kept up over time. We could pass a budget that stabilizes our childcare industry. So instead of seeing childcare centers close, we could see centers open and greater availability for childcare that workers need in North Carolina. I could go on. We could make incredible investments to produce a higher quality of life in North Carolina if that's the type of budget that lawmakers pass.
A really beautiful thing to think about investing in our own communities with our own dollars. Mariah, when we start to think about state tax money is being raised by everyday people, but not being spent on them right now, how is that fair for the people who elected these lawmakers into office?
Yeah, so the short answer is that it's not fair. So unfortunately, while North Carolina workers and families struggle with the cost of essentials with increased inflation and the unmet needs from the state budget impasse, powerful lawmakers in Raleigh have really focused their attention on prioritizing these policies for tax cuts that for corporations and the wealthiest at the expense of the rest of us. So these policy decisions have significantly reduced our state revenue and constrained our ability to invest in programs that improve well-being and make life more affordable, like public education, childcare, housing, healthcare, and infrastructure, which is really the building blocks of an economy and a state budget that works for us all. But some state lawmakers have a choice. They can change course, and these future tax cuts are not inevitable, and we can make sure to do something about that and to raise our voice in this process.
When it comes to making our voices heard and being more involved in this process, and I'm I really hope that a lot of North Carolinians want to see their state budget and their taxes reflect their well-being and be inclusive to them. What are some things that people can do, Mariah, to take action when it comes to seeing these changes, when it comes to seeing tax cuts and the state budget coming from um, leaving being stalled?
So people can let their state lawmaker know that we need a budget that really funds people's priorities and support everyone's well-being, and doesn't um, pass these tax cuts that only go to the wealthy and corporations. We need that money in our communities, especially when people are facing increased costs and increased economic uncertainty, even as we're growing as a state. So really letting lawmakers know um, that you have voted for to represent you and your priorities first, and not their own priorities when it comes to tax cuts. So right now we have the Budget and Tax Center. We are launching next week on March 25th. Actually, let me redo that. So right now at the Budget and Tax Center, we have launched our Love NC Fund NC Scavenger Hunt, which is a statewide opportunity for people to post on social media about what they want to see funded in their communities. So from March 25th until April 14th, we're asking people across the state to use social media to capture images of what's underfunded in our communities to make clear where these the money from the tax cuts isn't going, and we will make sure to make clear that to highlight where it is going to these corporations and the wealthy. So this is an all hands effort, and our goal is to really make sure this catches fire across the state. We want you to post widely, encourage others to join in, and help us cover North Carolina with a clear message that if lawmakers love NC, they need to fund NC.
Yes, if you love NC, we definitely want it to be funded. I want NC to be funded, and I would love to echo that, Mariah, to the state of North Carolina, that if you had $1 million for to spend in your community or your city, where would you want to see your tax dollars go? And more importantly, what would you want to see in that state budget? And I think participating in the scavenger hunt and showing your lawmaker what that looks like is a beautiful way for the people's voices to be heard and for them to share their thoughts with their community, and more importantly show how their needs could be being met even better with the state budget and moving closer to a more inclusive and more participatory budget process that really reflects the people. So thank you so much, you guys, for coming on to the Built by Us, and for the work that you do every day to make this fight more legible for the people who are living it. And the budget isn't abstract, it's classrooms, clinics, and families. And you guys have helped us see that so clearly today. If you would like to help the North Carolina Budget and Tax Center leverage the power of community voices to demand elected officials to enact the state budget based on the needs of North Carolinians, not the whims of corporations, the wealthy, and the special interests. We believe that better investments in healthcare, housing, workers' rights, and education are the foundation of the people's budget. And you can find out more information and sign the petition for the People's Budget at peoplesbudgetnc.org. And you can also participate in the Love NC Fund NC scavenger hunt and let your voice be heard. Thanks for listening to Built by Us. Connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, Bluesky, YouTube, and sometimes on TikTok. Stay on the lookout for our next episode, and just a reminder from Democracy NC, big change can happen when many people take small actions. And more importantly, the budget that is funded by us should be built by us. And that is what democracy is all about. Thanks for listening.